The rhythm of the Hudson against the pylons is a steady, rhythmic pulse. It is the heartbeat of a city that never sleeps, but at 3 in the morning, under a sky bleeding gray and black, it feels more like a countdown. The rain doesn't just fall here, it drives. It turns the salt-cracked wood of the 125th Street docks into a slick, treacherous mirror. Ray walked onto those docks with his shoulders squared. He wasn't just a man, he was an extension of Bumpy Johnson's will. In Harlem, Bumpy's name is the law that exists when the police precinct doors are locked. To wear the suit Ray wore, to drive the car Ray drove, was to be untouchable. But the rain doesn't care about reputations. The men waiting for him were shadows tucked between crates of illegal spirits and Italian silk. They didn't move with the frantic energy of street thugs. They moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of men who had permission to be there. Ray reached for his coat pocket, not for a gun, but for a cigar, a gesture of dominance, a sign that he wasn't afraid. He never got to light it. The first blow didn't come from the front, it came from the side, a heavy metallic crack that echoed off the shipping containers. Ray stumbled. The cigar fell into a puddle, its dry leaf soaking up the filth of the riverbank. When you represent Bumpy Johnson, you are expected to be made of iron. You are expected to be the last man standing, even when the world tilts on its axis. But tonight, the iron bent. Ray fought. He swung with the desperation of a man who knew that his life wasn't the only thing on the line. He knew that every time his fist missed, a piece of Bumpy the Legend was being chipped away. Every time a boot found his ribs, the invincibility of the Harlem Godfather was being questioned. The fight was short, brutal, silent save for the splashing of feet and the dull thud of bone on flesh. When it was over, Ray lay flat on the wet wood. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps. Above him, the shadows didn't laugh. They didn't gloat. They simply stood there, letting the rain wash the blood off their knuckles. One of them leaned down. He didn't speak to Ray. He spoke to the ghost of the man who wasn't there. "Tell Bumpy," the shadow whispered, "that the tide is coming in, and even he can't stop the ocean." They left him there, a broken soldier on a rainy pier. The loss wasn't just about a territory or a shipment of goods. It was about the silence that followed. For the first time in a decade, someone had struck a hand of Bumpy Johnson and lived to walk away. In the underworld, perception is the only currency that matters, and as Ray stared up at the black clouds, he knew that by sunrise, the exchange rate in Harlem would never be the same again. Everything had changed. The sun rose over Harlem not with a glow, but with a cold, unforgiving clarity. By 6 in the morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a city that felt scrubbed raw. News in this neighborhood doesn't travel by wire or print. It travels in the steam arising from manhole covers. It moves in the way a barber pauses with a straight razor against a neck. It's a low-frequency hum that vibrates through the floorboards of every tenement from 1/10th to 155th. Ray had been found. That was the headline, but the subtext was what mattered. Bumpy Johnson's reach had been shortened. At the corner of Lenox, the usual suspects were gathered, men who made their living reading the wind. They didn't talk loudly about what happened at the docks. You don't shout the name of a fallen king's soldier. You whisper it, testing the air to see if the lightning still strikes those who speak out of turn. "The Italians," one man muttered, leaning against a brick wall that still held the dampness of the night. "They didn't just break his ribs, they broke the seal." That was the feeling. For years, Harlem was a fortress. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just built a criminal empire, he had built a psychological wall. To touch one of his men was to invite a visitation from a ghost, a silent, calculated retribution that left no survivors and no questions. But as the morning progressed, the fear began to glaze over with a thin veneer of curiosity. The street dealers, the numbers runners, the lookouts, they all looked at the black Cadillacs passing by with a different set of eyes. They weren't looking for protection anymore. They were looking for a flinch. In the hallways of the brownstones, the mothers held their children a little closer. They knew that when a man like Bumpy is insulted, the response is rarely a surgical strike. It is a shifting of the tectonic plates. If the foundation of the neighborhood, Bumpy's absolute authority, was cracking, then the ceiling was bound to come down on everyone. Down in the Italian districts, the mood was different. The news of the rainy docks had reached the social clubs of East Harlem. There, the espresso was sweeter, the laughter was a bit more abrasive. They had tested the fence, they had poked the lion with a rusted spear, and the lion hadn't roared back yet. To the five families, Bumpy Johnson was an anomaly, a man who held territory they felt belonged to the natural order of their own expansion. He was a statesman in a world of butchers, and they had always mistaken his restraint for a lack of stomach. "He's getting old," they whispered over green felt tables. "He's reading too many books. He's forgotten that the only thing that keeps a man in power is the blood on his shoes." The predators began to stir. Small-time hitters who wanted to make a name for themselves started checking their revolvers. Rivals who had been paying tribute to Bumpy for a decade started wondering if the next envelope could be kept for themselves. The mythology of Bumpy Johnson was built on the idea that he knew everything before it happened, that he was a chess player moving pieces on a board only he could see. But as Ray sat in a hospital bed with his jaw wired shut, the board looked chaotic, the pieces looked scattered. The neighborhood was waiting. The city was holding its breath. Every eye in Harlem was turned toward one door, one address, waiting for the man who lived there to either step out and reclaim his throne or stay inside and let the vultures finish the meal. The armor wasn't just cracked, it was being stripped away, piece by piece, by the silence of the man who was supposed to protect it. Everything was changing, and in Harlem, change usually arrives with a funeral procession. The back room of the Palm Café does not belong to the city of New York. It is a sovereign state, a sanctuary of velvet, mahogany, and the heavy scent of imported tobacco. Outside, the world was screaming about the loss at the docks. Inside, there was only the rhythmic, mechanical tick of a grandfather clock. Bumpy Johnson sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from the hull of an ancient ship. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't breaking furniture, he wasn't cursing the names of the Italians who had dared to spill the blood of his man. He was reading. A copy of Machiavelli sat open on the blotter, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They were fixed on a small porcelain cup of black coffee. The steam rose in a straight, unwavering line, undisturbed by the heavy breathing of the man standing across from him. "They took the shipment, Bumpy," the messenger whispered. His voice was thin, vibrating with the kind of fear that comes from delivering bad news to a man who deals in absolutes. "They left Ray on the wood. They said the tide was coming in." Bumpy didn't look up. He didn't move a muscle. The silence in the room began to take on a physical weight. It pressed against the messenger's chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. In Harlem, Bumpy's silence was often more terrifying than another man's scream. It was the silence of a mathematician calculating a trajectory. It was the quiet of a fuse before the spark reaches the powder. Finally, Bumpy reached out. His fingers, long and steady, moved toward the coffee cup. He didn't shake. He didn't spill a drop. He took a slow, deliberate sip, then set the cup back down into the exact center of the saucer. "The tide," Bumpy said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as polished stone. "The tide is a predictable thing. It comes in and it goes out. It follows the moon. It doesn't have a choice." He looked up then. His eyes weren't filled with rage. They were filled with a cold, predatory intelligence. He wasn't looking at the messenger. He was looking through him, seeing the streets, the docks, and the social clubs of East Harlem as if they were squares on a board. "Ray is a good man," Bumpy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But when he fell, he let the sun shine on people who should have stayed in the dark. Bumpy stood up. He was a man who understood that power is not about the noise you make, but about the space you occupy. He walked to the window, looking out at the Harlem skyline. He saw the people walking below, the people who relied on his strength to keep the wolves at bay. "They think I'm wounded," Bumpy said to the glass. "They think because one soldier lost a fight in the rain, the general has forgotten how to go to war. They want to see what I'll do next. They're hungry for a spectacle." He turned back to the room. The messenger took a step back, hitting the doorframe. "Go to the hospital," Bumpy ordered. "Tell Ray he's still on the payroll. Tell him to heal. And tell the others to stay off the streets tonight. I don't want Harlem loud. I want it so quiet that you can hear a heart stop from 3 blocks away." The messenger nodded frantically and vanished through the door. Bumpy Johnson sat back down. He picked up a fountain pen and began to write a list of names. He didn't press hard on the paper. He didn't rush. Each stroke was precise. The loss at the docks had changed everything, yes. It had shifted the balance. It had invited the enemy to the table. But as Bumpy looked at the names on his list, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. The enemy thought they had won a battle. They didn't realize that Bumpy Johnson had just been given a reason to stop being a statesman and start being a ghost. The air in the room didn't just feel dangerous anymore. It felt final. By nightfall, the scavengers had arrived. They didn't come with sirens or the heavy tread of a raiding party. They came like a fever, quiet, persistent, and smelling of opportunistic sweat. Harlem at 10 p.m. usually had a specific song. It was the sound of jazz spilling out of basement clubs, the clatter of dice against a brick wall, and the constant rhythmic hum of a people who owned their own blocks. But tonight, the song was off-key. The tempo had slowed. Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the Palm Café. He didn't have a phalanx of guards. He had his coat, his hat, and the heavy silence he carried like a shield. He began to walk. This wasn't a retreat. It was an inspection. To rule Harlem is to understand the language of the sidewalk. Bumpy read the cracks in the pavement and the way the streetlights flickered. He saw the black sedan parked on the corner of 135th. It was a Cadillac, polished to a high shine that didn't belong in this part of town. It belonged to the Genovese family. In the past, that car wouldn't have dared to idle there. It would have moved through the neighborhood like a guest, eyes down, windows up. Tonight, the windows were down. The smoke from an Italian cigar drifted out into the Harlem air, a deliberate scent of colonization. Bumpy didn't stop. He didn't reach for the snub-nosed revolver in his waistband. He simply walked past it, his stride even, his eyes forward. He could feel the eyes of the gunmen inside the car tracking him. They were waiting for him to break. They were waiting for him to shout, to threaten, to show the world that he was rattled by the loss at the docks. But Bumpy Johnson didn't rattle. He stopped at a small newsstand run by a man named Pops, who had been blind for 20 years but could recognize a man's character by the sound of his step. "Evening, Pops," Bumpy said. The old man hesitated. Usually the greeting was met with a joke or a tip. Tonight, Pops's hands trembled as he folded a paper. "Evening, Mr. Johnson. It's a heavy night." "The air is just thick, Pops. It'll clear," Bumpy replied. He looked around. He saw the young men on the corners, the ones who usually stood tall when he passed. Tonight, they were looking at the Cadillac. They were looking at the power that had successfully bruised Bumpy's reputation. They were calculating their own futures, wondering if the man in the fine wool coat was a relic of a dying era. This was the danger of the lost fight. It wasn't the physical damage to Ray. It was the psychological permission it gave to the Vultures. If Bumpy was mortal, then his territory was up for grabs. If his soldiers could be beaten at the docks, then his storefronts could be taxed by outsiders. A man stepped out of the shadows near the Cadillac. It was a mid-level enforcer for the Italians, a man named Rico who had more ambition than sense. He leaned against a lamppost, blocking Bumpy's path. "Rough weather at the pier last night, Bumpy," Rico said, his voice loud enough for the boys on the corner to hear. "I heard the water was cold. I heard your boys don't swim so well." The street went dead silent. The jazz from the nearby club seemed to cut out mid-note. This was the moment. The perimeter had been breached. The disrespect was no longer a whisper. It was a challenge delivered in the heart of Bumpy's kingdom. Bumpy stopped. He stood inches from Rico. He was taller, his presence expanding until he seemed to swallow the light from the lamppost. He didn't look at Rico's hand, which was tucked into a jacket pocket, likely gripping a pistol. Bumpy looked directly into his eyes. He didn't speak for a long time. He let the silence stretch until Rico's smirk began to flicker, then fade. The enforcer's confidence began to leak out of him, replaced by the realization that he was standing in front of a man who had stared down much worse than a hired hand in a cheap suit. "You're a long way from home, son. The tide you're so worried about, it doesn't just wash things away. It brings things back to shore, things you don't want to see." Bumpy reached out. Rico flinched, expecting a strike, but Bumpy merely straightened Rico's tie. He patted the silk flat against Rico's chest, a gesture so patronizing, so utterly dominant that it felt more violent than a punch. "Go back to your car," Bumpy whispered. "Tell your bosses that I'm still measuring the wood for the crates. I'd hate for them to be the wrong size." Bumpy walked past him. He didn't look back. He had seen what he needed to see. He knew who was wavering. He knew who was watching. The vultures were circling, yes, but they were circling a man who was already preparing the trap. The walk continued. The pressure stayed. But as Bumpy disappeared into the shadows of 145th Street, the boys on the corner weren't looking at the Cadillac anymore. They were looking at the space where Bumpy had stood, wondering how a man could lose so much and still look like he owned the world. The rain had returned, as if the sky itself had a memory it couldn't suppress. Bumpy Johnson did not go to the docks with a fleet of cars. He did not go with 100 men brandishing Tommy guns. He arrived in a single black Chrysler, the engine purring like a cat in the dark. When he stepped out onto the salt-rotted wood of the 125th Street Pier, he was alone. Or, more accurately, he was the only one visible. The men who had broken Ray were there. They were waiting for a payoff, for a negotiation, or perhaps for a surrender. They stood in the same spots they had occupied 48 hours prior, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. They held the ground like conquerors, convinced that the loss Bumpy suffered had neutralized his sting. "You're a brave man, Bumpy," the leader of the group called out, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal of the warehouses. "Coming back here without your muscle. Most men would have sent a lawyer or a white flag." Bumpy didn't stop until he reached the exact spot where Ray's blood had been washed into the river. He looked down at the wood, then up at the men. His face was a mask of granite, illuminated only by the rhythmic sweep of a distant lighthouse beam. "I didn't come to negotiate," Bumpy said. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the sound of the crashing waves with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "And I didn't come for the shipment you stole. That whiskey was bottom shelf. I wouldn't serve it to a dog." A ripple of confusion went through the shadows. The enforcer stepped forward, his hand moving toward his belt. "Then why are you here, old man? To get what Ray got?" "I'm here," Bumpy said, taking a slow step forward, "to show you the anatomy of a reversal. You see, when you hit Ray, you thought you were taking a piece of my territory. You thought you were proving I was weak, but what you were actually doing was a roll call." Bumpy paused, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. "In the last 2 days, I've watched every man who smiled when they heard the news. I've watched every dealer who tried to skip a payment. I've watched every one of your bosses buy a bottle of champagne to celebrate a victory they didn't earn. You didn't break my armor. You just showed me where the rust was." Suddenly, the shadows behind the Italians began to move. From the crates, from the darkness of the warehouses, and from the very edges of the pier, men emerged. These weren't just soldiers. These were the faces of Harlem, the men who kept the lights on and the streets clean. They didn't have guns drawn. They had something far more terrifying. They had the absolute, unwavering permission of the neighborhood to be there. Bumpy leaned in close to the lead enforcer, so close the man could smell the peppermint on Bumpy's breath. "You thought you won because Ray fell," Bumpy whispered, "but Ray didn't lose that fight. He gave it to me. He stood there and took those hits so that I could see exactly who was holding the hammer. And now that I know, the tide isn't coming in for me, it's going out for you." Bumpy turned his back on them, a gesture of such total, calculated disrespect that it froze the hitman in place. He walked back toward his car, the sound of his shoes on the wet wood the only noise in the night. He didn't have to give an order. He didn't have to look back. The reversal was complete. The loss at the docks hadn't been a defeat. It had been a census. As Bumpy closed his car door, the shadows moved in, and the rain began to wash the pier once more. The sun rose over a Harlem that felt new. By dawn, the 125th Street docks were empty, the salt air having reclaimed the scent of the river. There were no sirens, no yellow tape, and no headlines. Harlem has a way of absorbing its own history, burying the jagged edges of the night beneath the rhythmic bustle of the morning commute. Ray eventually returned to his corner. He moved with a noticeable limp, a permanent souvenir of that rainy night, but his presence carried more weight than it ever had before. He wasn't looked upon as a soldier who had been beaten. He was seen as the man who had stood at the center of the storm, so Bumpy Johnson could map the winds. The 5 families retreated into the shadows of their own districts. The laughter and the social clubs of East Harlem died out, replaced by a chilling, quiet realization. They had tried to start a war by exploiting a perceived weakness, but Bumpy had turned their aggression into a census. He hadn't just defended his territory, he had refined it. By allowing a temporary loss, he had identified every wavering loyalty and every encroaching threat, neutralizing them before they could even draw a second breath. Every king knows that a crown is heavy, but Bumpy Johnson understood that the weight doesn't come from the gold. It comes from the absolute, terrifying silence required to keep it. The loss at the docks changed everything, because it reminded the world that Bumpy didn't just rule Harlem with his hands or his guns. He ruled it with a cold, mathematical patience. In the end, the rain always stops and the water eventually recedes. But in Harlem, the shadow of Bumpy Johnson remains, longer and more permanent than ever.